So, probably one of the biggest things I disagree with Donald Trump about is what we should do with free trade. So, free trade has gotten a lot of backlash in the past election cycle. We heard Donald Trump bashing it, we heard Bernie Sanders bashing it. So, we should really look at what free trade is and whether it helps the United States or hurts the United States. So, the first argument people tend to make against free trade is, well, we're going to lose jobs, right? So, to the untrained eye, if you see a bunch of jobs going away, outsourcing, then you don't tend to think, oh, well, free trade causes prosperity because we're losing jobs here in the United States. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Now, before 1995, the United States government under Bill Clinton, they signed NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and it was a surplus for trade. And shortly after that, near 2000, we had free trade agreements with China. So you would assume after this, repetition of free trade agreements, we would see a reduction in employment because, more jobs going away out of seas, that we're losing to Mexico and Canada and China, the less employment we would have in the United States. And that's simply not true, as you can see in this graph. So the main thing that I want to tell you is that free trade and protectionism do not affect employment at all. Protectionism simply makes a country poorer, and free trade essentially creates a more wealthy nation. So as you can see, long term, even before the trade agreements, employment was steadily rising. The number of jobs in the United States were steadily rising. Now, after NAFTA and after China, this trend basically stays the same. So this idea that free trade causes a loss in jobs is completely absurd. And it was highlighted actually a really long time ago by Frederick Bastiat. So he was a 19th century economist in France, and he created something called the Candlemakers Petition, in which he basically asked the King of France and his administration, because they were already doing tariffs, he said, well, let's ban the sun, right? Let's ban the sun. Everybody has to cover their windows during the daytime, and this will cause a increase in the number of candle makers in France, and it would create jobs. But once you even hear the hilarity of the argument, you understand that this can be applied to our current market. So why is banning the sun wrong, right? So yes, you would create an increase in demand for candles, but people would have to pay for those candles. And when they pay for the candles, they'll have less money left over to invest in other markets, like the food market, maybe the horse and buggy market, or other markets like that. So really, there is no change in employment. Yes, the candle maker job is increasing. There's more candle makers in France, but they'll be equally as less as, the butchers or the cheese makers or people who train horses, because people will just have less money to spend on those. So we can apply this argument to free trade. So in the first argument with the candle makers, it's obviously good to let the sun give us free money because it is helping us for no cost at all. Now, when it comes to free trade, lower prices and abundance is actually a good thing. So if we get free, or in this case, in reality, very cheaply priced products, then that's a good thing for our society. It means the standard of living in our society will increase, because now instead of paying for a $20 t-shirt, you can buy a $10 t-shirt, and now you can spend the other $10 on something else. So this idea that trade creates a sort of environment where the domestic producers are harmed, it's absolutely not true. There is absolutely no problem with letting competition flow throughout the market. And let's see another example of protectionism. So this is a Heritage Foundation article. It's talked about the benefits of free trade, a guide for policymakers. And this is actually one of the biggest types of protectionism in the world. It's called the European CAP, and it's basically, and it stands for the European Common Agricultural Policy. So basically what it is, it's $60 billion worth in subsidies for domestic producers to basically cut out competition from foreign lands. And what happens basically is, as you can see, the end result of these policies has been to deprive European consumers access to more goods at fairer prices. So basically all of Europe has to pay for more for agricultural produce than they could if they had free trade. So now instead of a potato costing $5 a pound, maybe now it's $8 a pound, $10 a pound. So you're really drastically lowering the standard of living with these policies. There's also an argument that, well, that hasn't happened in the United States. We haven't had such a big protectionist policy. And actually, we have. In the 1930s, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was passed. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was the biggest act of protectionism in the United States for its entire history, even now in the 21st century. And why was it? Because it raised the tariff on certain goods coming into the country from Europe and other countries as well from 50% to 100%. And this stifled employment drastically. In 1929, the stock market crash occurred, and a year later, the anniversary of the stock market crash, unemployment was actually dropping. And then the Smoot-Hawley Tariff is passed into law, and basically unemployment drastically increases to above 20%. And on this graph, we can see what happens to U.S. equities, which is synonymous with U.S. wealth. So we see this steady decline overall. June 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff is signed into law. We see a drastic decrease in wealth in this country. And it kind of stabilizes, slowly increases, of course, but it basically stabilizes until the Reciprocal Tariff Act is pushed and U.S. equities slowly increases. The next thing that I want to show you is free trade. What does it do to unemployment? As we talked about, free trade doesn't do anything to employment. Well, but what about trade deficits? You always hear this talk about trade deficits. It's a terrible thing. It causes losses to our economy, unemployment as well. But this graph shows that rising trade deficits absolutely do not lead to rising unemployment rates. So the main thing that you should understand by the end of this video is that free trade helps countries a lot more than it hurts countries. Countries that have free trade tend to become much more prosperous. So look at South Korea versus North Korea, or East Germany versus West Germany in the 1900s. Free trade absolutely helps everyone because everyone gets a fair price, there's more competition, and there's more good in our society. Thank you.